Thank you, Tom, and welcome everybody. I'll be speaking today on the individualisation of warfare. So this is basically an attempt to bring together discussion of cyber, big data, drones, and other emerging technologies. Now, I'm a military ethicist and philosopher, traditionally trained, so I basically prepare speeches in advance, so I apologise if I put you to sleep, but hopefully the content will keep you sufficiently interested. Now, for most of us here today, I suspect that war is a relatively distant and somewhat impersonal thing, even though some of us have been to war and others have dedicated our lives to researching it. When we hear the last post played at commemorative services on Anzac Day or Remembrance Day, and we pause to think about those who gave their lives in defence of our nation, we picture them in their serried rank, I guess. Whether it be in the long line of headstones at perfectly manicured military cemeteries, or poppies adorning the seemingly endless wall of names at the Australian War Memorial. For much of the last few centuries, the war dead have been relatively anonymous to their enemies as well. At home, I have pictures of troops from the Australian Imperial Forces. In some of these pictures, amongst the young boys who were barely old enough to fight and the finely dressed but rather tired-looking officers, were people thought to be my family members. Now, like many of you from military families, I've been able to piece together the names and fates of those pictured, from old family stories, faded notes on the back of photographs, and more recently, internet archives that trace every distinguishing physical feature of those people, their next of kin, what they did and where they did it. Some of us will know that our grandfathers or great-grandfathers were killed or injured, that they had loved ones, that they were X feet and Y inches tall. This is all very personal sort of stuff, one might say, but the impersonal nature surfaces yet again when we realise that many men were shot down, likely by Germans, that probably knew none of these or other more pertinent facts. They were unlikely to have been surveilled for any extended period of time, or to have been on the radar of Germany's intelligence services. They were shot largely because they were on the wrong side in the wrong place at the wrong time. To see how one might be shot just for being a soldier on the wrong side, many will look to political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. He wrote during the English civil wars of the 17th century, and he wrote that the primal world of men is violent, a wretched landscape of war directed against all. To shield humankind from this lawless state of nature, Hobbes argued for the establishment of a sovereign who would organise a commonwealth of citizens to ensure peace, on the basis that they would be more efficient and effective in doing so. In the construction of this commonwealth, war shifted from being a civil conflict resolved by violence between individuals to battle waged between national communities. Now, the state of nature is a bit of a mix of sort of fact and fiction, okay? But Hobbes essentially lays the groundwork for nation-states that we have today, and also the framework of international relations and law. The ethicists in the room will also know that what he was doing was offering support for traditional just war theory and military ethics, developed by Christian thinkers in the Middle Ages. The great questions of the recourse to war, or jus ad bellum in Latin, are delegated to states and to the sovereigns who rule them, whereas individual citizens and soldiers are subjected to a more limited set of so-called jus in bello rules, and we've already heard a bit about those yesterday, a code of conduct covering what you may or may not do in the course of war. As long as soldiers do not directly target civilians or act disproportionately, they do not act wrongly if they fight in an otherwise or objectively unjust war. In any case, all of this is beginning to change, and I think in a pretty big way. War is becoming more personal. Anyone who's ever studied the tiniest bit of sociology as an undergraduate or whatnot will know that individualisation has emerged as an influential characterisation of contemporary society, particularly Western society. Explored by big-name sociologists such as Anthony Giddens and Zygmunt Bauman, the concept of individualization is focused on the way that action is increasingly mediated through and by the individual person. There is, according to the theory, a new relationship forming between individual and society through an ongoing, multifaceted, and generally indirect feedback process. The changes linked to this evolving relationship and to individualization, to make my point clear, are now pervading the military such that in today's conflict, we increasingly know our enemies and are moving away from defining enemy forces in terms of categorical, group-based judgments and toward definitions that are tied to judgments about the individual acts and roles of enemy figures. That is to say that we are increasingly targeting select individuals at specific points in time and space, rather than enemy formations that happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, insofar as it means that they're targetable. This individualization is facilitated by dramatic military technical developments in the fields of robotics, cyber, and big data. We now have sophisticated surveillance aircraft and drones in such numbers that there is the potential for a voyeuristic relationship to form between drone pilots and their targets, who may be watched for days, weeks, or in some cases even months on end. These technologies do such a good job complementing human intelligence sources that some countries now have kill lists supported by large dossiers of information detailing individual activities, education, financial status, sexuality, browsing, history, and the like. Of course, it's not that difficult these days to come across information that may support targeted killings in the modern age. More and more people store their data on the internet, governments keep data online, banks keep financial data, your phone provider stores your metadata, hospitals keep health data, and social media sites keep our photos, videos, and way too much personal information, except, I guess, Tom's information. But big data, social network analysis, and the like are very much in the domain of modern military forces. And in rapidly improving facial and voice recognition software, I guess these things, they really go nicely alongside sort of wide area persistent surveillance, technologies like Argus, and things like that. And it's clear that war it's just getting more personal, I feel. And this will become ever more true as the technologies of warfare continue to become more individualized, and the boundaries between targeted killing in regular warfare and targeted killing in broader national security operations becomes even more blurry than they are today. Indeed, Charles Dunlap, who we heard from yesterday, has previously written that we're entering the age of the hyper-personalization of war, and that this is going to take things to a whole new level. Others, such as Gabriella Blum at Harvard, argue that the individualization of warfare is becoming more like policing, with its focus on individual harms, individual victims, and individual culpability. If individualization means war is becoming more tailored and deliberative, it will become possible, she says, and others say as well, to add to warfare some of the due process protections common in law enforcement, but historically considered unfeasible on the battlefield. The individualization of warfare has thus the potential to bring war more in line with common human rights norms. In fact, it's not just potential. David Roden at Oxford University is a famous military ethicist that many of you will be familiar with, and he's utilising the concept of individualisation to support revisionist just war theory and to overcome the prudential reasons for sticking to the division between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Now, in many respects, the individualisation or hyper-personalisation, or whatever you want to call it, of war is likely to be a good thing. Targeted killings may be troublingly intimate, but they're surely better than more indiscriminate forms of killing. Just war theory, after all, obligates parties to conflict to avoid the intentional targeting of civilians and to take all reasonable measures to avoid causing incidental civilian deaths. And the technologies, the individuating technologies of modern warfare, represent a significant step forward in our ability to ensure that wars kill or harm as few people as possible. So long, of course, as our decision makers don't fall into the trap of engaging in more warfare on the basis of, holding these new technologies. But, compared to the firebombing of Dresden, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, or the not-so-precise attacks on Kosovo, weapons capable of killing only specific individuals seem like a moral advance in some pretty clear ways. However, I want to point to some of the problems and challenges associated with the individualisation thesis, and also the general implications of the individualisation of war. First of all, it needs to be said that while war is becoming individualised in the respect that targeting is increasingly based on an individuated assessment of specific combatants, this is determined through almost evidentiary analysis and weighing of operational relevance within a much larger network apparatus. This represents a dramatic transformation in the targeting criteria applied on the modern battlefield, and the intelligence officers in the room will know that more than me, but also in the number of people required for this application. Warfare has in many cases become lawfare, with masses of lawyers and other high-level decision-makers becoming involved in the targeting process in ways that the frontline soldier could not have imagined 100 years ago. If we think less about targeted killings in regular warfare and more about sort of CIA-style attacks, we also know from recently leaked documents that there is a significant number of decision-makers involved in the authorization of an attack, and some would suggest in the US case right up to the president. In these regards, conflict is actually becoming a much more collective effort, but with power centralised at higher and more bureaucratic levels. On an operational level, it must also be acknowledged that there are limits to individualisation. There are limits to all sorts of senses, some of which may be overcome by technology in the future, some of which will not. We must also understand and be careful, as citizens of the developed world, not to take for granted the basic identity management functions of modern state bureaucracy. This structure begins with the foundational identity documents that we all hold, such as birth certificates, and then expands through one's lifetime within a highly complex system of state credentialing that's required for participation in civil life and, more importantly, in economic life in the developed world. But this is pretty much absent in the developing world. According to one recent estimate, as many as 1 in 3 children in the developing world do not have any kind of official identity document or registration generated at birth. The operational significance of this is not only a concern for counter-terrorism and insurgency and whatnot, but also in peacekeeping, in humanitarian relief missions, and we might eventually come to see also in regular operations. Another problem is that while individualised killing technologies are currently the prerogative of technologically advanced states, this will soon change too. Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and other non-state actors are already attuned to the emerging possibilities of personalised warfare. In 2007, for instance, terrorist sympathisers hacked into the email and telephone records of Danish soldiers serving in Afghanistan and used the information to harass their family members, basically. More recently, I think it was in March actually, an Islamic State website posted the names and addresses of select US military personnel, many of whom I believe were drone operators, and urged our brothers in America, to use their term, to take the final step of killing them. Drone and facial recognition technologies are already commercially available, if not available from the likes of China and Russia, who on-sell these things, and in some cases have already been used by terrorist groups to test the defences of developed states. Some some, even if we believe that sort of the Australian government and others will use these technologies responsibly, which is not a foregone conclusion, I might add, something, we cannot rest assured in the fact that others will not do so. This must be taken into account in the moral calculus when states are resorting to war. For if the employment of individualising technologies is likely to promote retaliatory attacks, this could adversely affect the jus ad bellum proportionality criterion. So the potential sort of response that we're likely to provoke has to be factored in there. But more generally, I wonder whether the individualisation of war is taking us, where it's taking us. Will we end up targeting political leaders or extending combatant status to civilian programmers, weapons engineers and the like? The rise of this form of war, while promising to offer greater protections to civilians, in some ways seems to challenge the general prohibition against directly targeting political leaderships and other groups of similar importance and responsibility as a tactic of modern warfare. With the rise of professional militaries, political leaders no longer led armies directly into battle, thus creating a clear differentiation between those who conduct war at the policy level versus those who wage it on the battlefield. And those that designed weapons were always a long way from the battlefield, generally speaking, in history. The practical implication has been that strikes against political figures and weapons designers have generally not evolved as a central, or more importantly, morally sanctioned component of military strategy. However, this is complicated by the ambiguity of distinguishing between operational and political leadership in modern war, and the blurry line between modern-day combatants and engineers and programmers, the latter of which nowadays work near the theatre of combat in robot hospitals or in the digital battlefield, on the digital battlefield. The technologically driven individualisation of war has complicated these distinctions in a number of different ways, as status-based or functional criteria no longer offer a clear template for targeting. Could it be that the individualisation of conflict amounts to the individualisation of the enemy more than anything else? And this is something I would like to get your opinion of when I conclude in just a moment. We target more people in more places with automated technologies and adjudicative practices that in some respects seem to represent devolution. Think back to my earlier reference to Hobbes. The idea was that we handed power over to the sovereign by virtue of it being able to better protect the rights of individuals than individuals themselves. Could it be that the technologies behind the individualisation of war, and which are now changing the state of affairs, could it be, I should say, that they're now changing the state of affairs such that we're heading back toward the Hobbesian state of nature, albeit very slowly? And what are the other problems and challenges that I've noted, both practical and moral? And can you enlighten me, perhaps, and perhaps note a couple of others for the individualisation of warfare and that general individualisation thesis as well? And on that note, I'll pause and take questions.
So is the end state of so many non-state players that the ADF may be used in Australian domestic affairs?
Well, the first thing I should say is I think the ADF is going to be confronted by this less so than the US military. So when we think about non-state actors and their likely actions, the list that was put out of the drone operators that I mentioned in my speech, that was, again, US drone operators, okay? But I think we do increasingly need to be prepared for, what this is going to mean for us. And
so another Link Cafe?
Well, maybe not quite to that level, but we do need to start thinking about the responses of our enemies to this sort of these individuating technologies, and we're only now just embarking upon the purchase of armed drones and whatnot here in Australia. And while I don't think that Australia is likely to pursue them in the same way that that the US has done, we do need, again, we do need to think about what sort of responses these technologies are likely to evoke. If we engage in asymmetric and individualizing warfare, where maybe an enemy can't respond in a traditional way, what are they going to do? We need to be thinking about that.
Question.
Yep. So Zach Lambert, Army. You just spoke then about the hyper-personalisation of war and more specifically the new technologies in an asymmetric context, and how this potentially is moving towards the policing side of things. The point I'd like to make before I ask my question is that the technologies you've described primarily work in an environment where it's essentially uncontested. Things like drones, things even like the cyber warfare, open source cyber warfare that's being used to locate individuals is essentially done uncontested. And as a result, it sort of appears almost as though it's intelligence-based covert action rather than military warfare as such. So I guess my question is, as we move towards a future where it's more likely that adversaries will not allow us to have complete uncontested air control, complete uncontested access to the cyber environment, where will this hyper-personalisation of warfare go if suddenly things that we take for granted, like access to these environments, are no longer allowed or provided to us?
Right, so I think you're spot on that these technologies are sort of largely uncontested at the moment. But yeah, as you rightly say, we are progressing, and as I've argued, we are progressing toward a very big change in that way. Look, I'm not an expert in sort of violent extremism or anything like that, but I guess my concern is that the scholars that are engaged in this debate, are thinking about that progression and are trying to use this as a way of collapsing jus in bello and jus ad bellum. They're sort of trying to bring them together, and that for me is the big problem, because I don't think, even if that uncontested nature changes over time, I don't think to collapse these tangents of just war theory together is going to be particularly fruitful for those in the military at any time in the near future, even if things are much more contested. I think the only way we can reasonably sort of collapse these categories together would be if we were to have sort of a world government type thing. Otherwise, there are always going to be very strong prudential reasons, if not other moral reasons, for keeping them together. But I'm not sure whether that answers your question. But
you're concerned about more undeclared wars or more undeclared conflicts. Is that what troubles you about collapsing them?
Yeah, yes, and I mean, those things have to be factored in at the jus ad bellum level. So these sort of potential retaliatory options need to be factored in the jus ad bellum proportionality criterion. But
so in a cyber attack, when none of your people are killed, is it legitimate to kill the people who didn't kill you but disrupted your way of life?
Well, that's the thing, yes. And I'm not at all suggesting that we would, say that a kinetic response or whatnot wouldn't be permitted in response to a cyber attack, either one that we've launched or has been launched against us. But we do need to start challenging the assumptions of history and start thinking.
I'll be assured I have no way of answering my own question. That's why I'm kind of putting it to you, John.
Sure.
That's another question. Professor Dunlap and then Rob Sutton.
I think the answer to the question might be the rise of the micro-drone, which will be on the contested battlefield. And it's a very difficult problem because the technology for the hyper-personalization can be small enough to go into a micro-drone. But I think when you say that the more discrimination you can have, the more likely you're going to, comply with jus in bello. And the same rules would apply with any type of weapon as would be a hyper-personalized weapon that is looking for a specific individual. But Isn't the real issue what it will do to the martial ethic in this sense? You know, part of what warriors do is they have a shared risk. And in the future, when they're only going after the sergeant major and the captain and the weapons officer or whatever it may be, you don't have that shared risk because they won't have to go after everybody. They can just go after, and I'm wondering what that might happen, what that might do to the internal morale and the warrior ethos within the unit. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I completely agree. And I think you're sort of pointing to the notion of individual risk, so the combatant level, I guess. And I think that's yet another reason for keeping the important distinction between ad bellum and in bello proportionality as well, because while I have argued that we need to be looking at the ad bellum proportionality requirement in terms of the responses that can be brought back, you point to a very you point to the idea of this notion of risk and how it's going to be challenged in the future if it's really only these people that are making the key decisions. So what's that going to mean? And those sort of discussions need to be had at the in bello level as well. So, but yeah, I agree, and I think going forward that actually it's not going to be just weapons officers and the major or whatnot that's going to be being targeted. I really do think we're also going to have to start re-examining sort of rules and criteria and conceptual analyses around combatant status, because maybe not in 10 years, maybe not in 20 years' time, but the nature of combatant status is changing in a big way as well with this hyper-personalisation or individualisation of war. So we're going to really need to rethink that.
So a hacker is a combatant?
Well, I mean, there have been debates in the history of military ethics about the nature of combatant status as it is, and whether we should be able to target weapons designers and such. But people have provided all sorts of reasons as to why we should not, and many of them are slippery slope type arguments. But
where are you on the slope right now on whether a hacker is a combatant?
Well, it depends what sort of activity they're involved in, yes? So if they're engaging in sort of state-sanctioned war, then, something inside of me thinks that if an enemy combatant were to, infiltrate our country and go and attack that person in Canberra or something, well, perhaps that's morally sanctioned. I don't know. Maybe not by our ordinary moral rules, but
you'd want to go as far as saying the complexity is not getting less; it's getting more.
Exactly, and we're going to need to think about it more, because it'll be our drone operators that are having their names released on databases in the future, not the US. So.
Right, Rob Southern, make this the last question, short one if we can.
Rob Sutherland, Army Chaplain. Thank you very much for the presentation and for raising some of the really interesting issues that are in there. My question follows a little from the previous one. It seems to me from what you're saying is that we're actually now putting someone who can be sitting in a very safe location, perhaps in a different country, into the role previously only occupied by some of our most highly trained Army people, that is the role of the sniper. And I'm concerned that actually the person sitting there watching the screen can have so much relationship with the person who is the target that in effect it's almost becoming if you like, a legitimate, a legalised murder in the mind or in the spirit of the person who's doing it. They know so much about that person that it's almost getting to that relationship. That can have significant effects for the morality, the moral injuries that Professor Frame was talking about yesterday. Have you got any thoughts as to how we might prepare those people in the safe environments to be doing the job that previously only the most highly trained of our people were doing?
Right. I think that relationship can go both ways, actually. I think, as I said, it can turn into a sort of voyeuristic type thing. We may become so attached to the sort of people that we're surveilling that, that we do, suffer greater moral injury as a result. It could go the other way, of course, that we become somewhat detached from what's happening on the ground or in other areas of operations, such that, you know, actually that mental detachment lessens any moral injury. I'm not sure, you know, there would be psychologists that could study this in greater detail, but yeah, so I'm not sure which way that's going to go. When you look at, you know, in response to the US attacks, when you go on YouTube and you type in war porn and drone porn and that sort of thing on the internet, and you see the sort of footage the sort of comments that are attached to some of these drone strike videos and whatnot, you really get a feel for how it can go either way. So I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to which way it might go. But we do need to be thinking about how we train this next generation of combatants, I would call them, and what the right balance is between sort of, you know, field sort of tactical skills and these higher level intellectual sort of moral, legal, reasoning skills are as well. I would suggest that the Army folks here will always see, you know, someone in Cyber Command as being trained in, you know, going through the general service officer sort of training at Duntroon or whatever else, and I think there's a good reason for maintaining some of that training to keep you attached to the realities of war, because while we are going toward this hyper-personalisation or the individualisation of war, there's nothing there to say that, you know, one day we may you know, we could potentially revert back to traditional warfare with all of the horror that it entails. And we always need to maintain that capability, obviously, to fight in that sort of war. So, I don't know, getting the balance right between, you know, the type of skills required by the normal soldier and, you know, the future combatant, the cyber people and the drone operators. I'm not sure what the exact balance is going to be there, but we need to think about that more, I guess. You know, that's to take the easy way out, but there need to be much more comprehensive studies done as to, you know, as to how to go about this in the right way.
Thank you. Jai has put a number of questions to you. If at morning tea or at lunch you've got perspectives that you can share with him, I know he'd be most grateful to hear certainly from you. Would you please join me in thanking him for his presentation?